Okay, so thank you everybody for coming to this week's Refold Roundtable. Today I'm joined by Alex, aka Skypon, Toast, and Tyler, aka Sin, and we're going to be discussing the benefits and drawbacks of different types of immersion with different levels of comprehension. So who wants to start us off? Who's got some thoughts on this?
I think that my initial thought is that, like, once you're above 50% comprehension, things feel more or less kind of equivalent in how much gain you get for me. Because I think that I pick up similar amounts of things between understanding half of words and understanding all of the words minus one of them.
That's interesting you say that. Personally, I don't mean to be pedantic by saying this, but I think a lot of people would agree too that the whole words understood metric, the whole percentage thing is kind of, I don't know, I feel like it doesn't give us that much info. Because personally, sometimes you understand all the words in a sentence, but you don't really get it. It's more like, can you get the sense of the idea behind the sentence, which is even harder to judge because sometimes you might just misinterpret what a sentence means and think you understand what it meant, but you actually don't know. But I like to just think of it like if I'm following along with like the main idea, whatever that means. I know it's a loose criteria, but then I consider it like, worth my time.
Yeah, I guess I fell for a trap by coming out swinging with 50%. No. Like, oh yeah, I have my percentages, but like we've had this discussion before. We agree that percentages aren't a great number to use.
No, I still use them too because it's just...
My question is what exactly is 50% comprehension? Because I don't know if word coverage is the same as comprehension. If you have 98% word coverage, is that the same as 98% comprehension? I'm not quite sure.
Okay, let me pose the question back to you. How would you define percent comprehension? Because I don't even know if comprehension is reducible to a percentage like that.
I don't know if you can put a number on it.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And comprehension can vary so much. I'll give an example. I recently, have been dabbling in Chinese, and occasionally I'll understand something if it weren't how it is. And what I mean by that is, like, if I see a character that I know how to read, I can't actually read it in this font, or this person's accent is different than what I'm used to. And I feel like when it comes to, I like word coverage generally because it's a nice metric, but I don't think it's a perfect metric, and I don't think it directly translates to comprehension.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
And something that I see at my sort of baby level Chinese is that I'll have the word coverage and I'll still not understand what's going on. I feel like this is less of an issue as you get more advanced in a language, but definitely early on, having word coverage and having recognition doesn't mean you understand what all the words are doing in the sentence together, which is just a long roundabout way of sort of reiterating what Alex said.
Yeah, that you can understand, because it hit me hard with Chinese because I'm also dabbling in Chinese, of course, but there's the E character, the one character, and it's like you immediately learn it, you learn to spot it, I'm like, oh, that means one, and then I'm only learning like days later, oh, it's actually just a component in many other words that use that character, and it doesn't just always mean one.
So this is something that's really interesting to me. So with Filipino, which is like arguably my main sort of second language, you tend to have words that have a whole bunch of bound morphemes. So you stack on these prefixes or suffixes or circumfixes or infixes or whatever. And when you learn a root word and you have good command over all of the affixes, you can look at a brand new word and understand what it means. What I've noticed with Chinese, at least, is that I will know all of the unbound morphemes because they stick these unbound morphemes that are parts of other words or can stand alone on their own. And they have these like weird compound words where I might recognize the component, but not know what it means when it's with another component. And there's also like weird sort of like separable verbs in Chinese. It kind of reminds me of English a little bit, where I don't have that issue with Filipino. Because with Filipino, you didn't have these really long mega words, but if you have good command over the grammar, you can instantly guess what it means. Whereas with Chinese, it seems a lot more random, and I feel like you have to sort of, your word coverage is not your real word coverage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It's the same with German, I feel, in a lot of ways, not just with, they have a very productive grammar when it comes to taking a root word and adding things onto it, and you get a new word, and you can guess what that word means 9 times out of 10, at least approximately. And then they also have modal particles, where it's like, you learn a word once, and you're like, okay, I kind of get it, and then you see it used in a way that makes no sense, and you're like, I don't get it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is all to say that, no, go.
Well, so the topic is, what are the benefits of high comp versus low comp stuff? So we actually paid people. We paid like 50 people to watch 40 videos in Spanish. Okay. And we built a little browser plugin. And we had them rate 2 things. We had them rate their comprehension and their enjoyability. And what we found was that higher comprehension was, on average, with native content, directly correlated with enjoyability.
That's not a surprise to me at all.
Yeah.
On the flip side, I've recently come back to Chinese, and I said, I'm going to start over. I'm going to do it all in trad, and I'm going to be a Chinese baby, and I'm going to read these 150 character books. It's taken me ages to get through the first one because it's so boring.
Right.
I understand it. I don't think I've run into a character that I can't read in it. But at the same time, it's so limited and constricted that I don't enjoy it.
Absolutely. This is a sort of, I don't know if you want to say something, Toast. I'll be quick here. But this is a kind of a maybe odd parallel to make or comparison to make. But that reminds me of how kind of certain ALG videos work, certain comprehensible input videos. Of course, I had to bring this up. This is probably an important thing to bring up in this when we're talking about comprehensibility. If for anyone not familiar, these kind of quote-unquote CI videos are tailored toward beginners, using simple language, repeating, but also striving in the best cases to be enjoyable in some way. And one of those ways I found is if videos are not predictable. You know, a lot of people I've seen a lot of people follow the certain format of, I'll tell like a story or a fairy tale from like a German fairy tale or something, if it's like a German CI channel. And if it's really famous, then maybe the person listening already knows how the story goes. And this in turn would probably mean higher comprehensibility. But since you already know how the next 8 minutes or however long the video is, how that's going to play out, then your brain just starts to wander because you're like, okay, then they're going to say this word, and okay, I'm just waiting until they say the word that I associate with this meaning, and it's, at least I get very impatient with that. I think there needs to be that element of surprise in that scenario. So yeah, I just wanted to make that comparison.
I've definitely noticed a lot with predictability being a big factor, because that's like the moment my comprehension slips, because like with the comprehensible input I've been watching lately, there's a lot of them at my level where people will just like introduce this sentence and then go through this sentence asking questions like, they say someone did something, who did something, someone did what, and then something is the answer. And it's like, if they do that for a bunch of sentences in a row, it's like, okay, you predict all the questions, you know how to answer it by the time you hear the first sentence, even if you don't know what the sentence actually means. And there's also ones that are like really interesting to me, and then they randomly pause to like count to 10 or something, and I'm like, and then I lose focus, and then I never get it back when they stop counting it to 10 and the sentences are hard again.
Yeah, it's hard to make these videos. It's hard to train people to
But we're sort of talking about the beginning level here. I definitely think as you progress in the language, it becomes much less of an issue.
Mhm.
Because even if you have less than 98% word coverage, you can sort of follow along with a plot and get enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, I think, at least for German, when I was starting to get 80% plus coverage of word coverage, I guess, but even sentence level 60-ish percent coverage, like things are starting to get a lot better around that point, I think.
Well, let's take a look here, Tyler. You're quite advanced in Japanese. You've got a really big vocab. You have read a lot of books. And what is your experience with, the type of comprehension when you were a baby Japanese learner versus being able to go in and have higher comprehension? What did you feel was most beneficial?
So which is more beneficial, lower or higher comprehension?
Correct.
Well, anecdotally, when I had higher comprehension, I found myself pretty much narrowing in on acquiring the subtle nuances of particles in the language that have like a million different use cases. And so, like, that compared to when I first started out, I was acquiring just pretty much everything in the language, all kinds of stuff, right? But I feel like higher comprehension does allow you to actually focus in on acquiring like that low-hanging fruit, right? But those things you might be trying to acquire, in the case of like Japanese, for example, could be a particle that has a lot of different uses, and it just might take a long time to acquire. So I don't know, because it's kind of interesting. I kind of found that part of it frustrating, because it would take like seeing it in like 10 million different contexts for it to actually click. But I mean, yeah. So I just feel like there's like just different like benefits to each, pros and cons.
Yeah, I think that's also similar to German's particles in that you just have to see them used a lot, and then you start to get an intuition for how they're used and what they kind of mean.
Mm-hmm.
And for really getting a grasp on them, I think you need a lot of sentences where you understand all the words except the particle, and you can focus on that.
Exactly.
I would agree.
I think this also applies not just to word definitions, but also things like accent, things like pronunciation. I realize for me in the languages that I've studied that I don't know why. I'm gonna compare my experience to Isaac, who's a Japanese learner who really likes to go straight for the phonetics of a language. And I also like pay attention to it, but it really isn't until much later when I feel like I basically understand everything on a meaning level, where my brain really kind of naturally just starts to shift its focus toward, okay, how exactly are they pronouncing that word, and can I repeat that? And I like check myself when I'm immersing if I can repeat stuff. But yeah, so I think comprehensibility is really important because it does give our brain the opportunity to acquire those difficult, untranslatable aspects of language that just take a lot of exposure to acquire.
Yeah, it's like freeing up more like space in your brain to focus on like the smaller pieces instead of like being overwhelmed by everything that you don't understand. So
yeah, I'm reminded of the time that I was going hard on Spanish, and I had already read a light novel or two in Spanish. Shout out to Jose Luis Vasquez from Mexico. He's a Spanish speaking author who writes original light novels that are pretty good in Spanish. And I was already getting pretty comfortable with the language, but I was given a graded reader by Bree, and it was just like a baby tier graded reader. It was all in like the present tense, and I knew all the words. And at that point, I was really able to focus on something called the personal in Spanish. So in Spanish, you need to put this before a person when they're the direct object. So like Jorge llama a Maria. It's like, Jorge calls Maria. But in Spanish, you have to put that there, but only if it's a person. You don't do it for non-humans. And I think at that point I was able to actually acquire it because I knew all of the vocab around it. I'm like, hey, now I can focus on this grammar point that I really couldn't focus on when I was too busy grabbing new words and doing lookups.
Yeah. I know Matt also talks about, or has talked about in the past, something that he called persistent puzzles, which are these, any given language might have a few of them or a couple, which are just really hard to grasp and are like our brain is trying to figure it out the whole time that we're learning a language and doesn't really click until the end. So it could be like, well, again, output production is one thing, and like for gender, for example, is at least for me, and I've heard for other people, hard to really output perfectly, even if you've done a lot of input, despite your comprehension being good. But I'm talking about also just on a comprehension level, like I think in Japanese he gives the example of kakeru, and then, which, I mean, I don't know that much Japanese. I just know that this is a verb, or can be paired with lots of different phrases, and when you would translate them to English, they would mean something completely different in each case, but really the verb, the word, has kind of one larger meaning that's not easy to, express in English. And in Italian, I think of ci and ne, which are like, they can mean a lot of different, they're usually grammatical points in the languages that I'm familiar with. But yeah, these things, despite them being essential facets of the language, despite probably being presented them, if you were to take a class, they'd probably present them to you pretty early. They just don't really click until way later, and there's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, those sort of a tangent, sorry.
No, I totally get it. So I recently got back into language learning. I was sort of in a little bit of a slump, kind of a little depressed, not doing a whole bunch. And I started back with Mandarin. I'm now on day 12. But one thing I've started doing is taking classes. And I know you're like, Refold are taking classes. I just find interacting with a native speaker to be very rewarding. Early output is totally fine. But I tend to test in around the HSK3, which is very, very low vocab level. And I might have the vocab for it, but I don't have any of the grammar. And I've been tested on outputting these structures that do get taught very on. There's some sort of case marking particle, ba. I don't really fully understand it. And it does get introduced very early, whereas I feel like I didn't really start acquiring case in Tagalog until much later, And that's sort of where the persistent puzzles happen, is these are basic things that are not easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cases in German were one for me as well. Like, you hear about them lesson 5 or whatever, but I didn't really start to grasp them until well into stage 3, well over 1,000 hours of German input.
Yeah, there was actually, I don't remember what particle it was exactly, but I remember I was already like 2.5 years into immersing, and this is like 1.5 years into reading literature or something. And it was like, after all this time, I finally acquired the usage, like this very subtle, nuanced usage of this one fucking particle that it just like took 2.5 years to acquire.
That's how it be.
Yeah. That's how it be.
But I do think ultimately higher comprehension allows you to start acquiring things.
No, absolutely. The higher the comprehension, the better. And even if you're basically understanding every single thing, this is my take, feel free to disagree with it, but I think there's always some aspect of language that you can improve on, especially even if you're advanced, but even more in the beginner stages. Say if you were to watch a CI video where you understood basically every single word, but okay, you understood the meaning. That's that level, and again, there's depths, there's layers to that. Like maybe you're missing a nuance of a word or something, and you wouldn't know until like later down the line, until you've heard it used in a bunch of different scenarios, and you're like, oh, it actually has this broader meaning, and its usage in this sentence that I first saw it in is an offshoot of the bigger meaning. Whatever. And then there's also the pronunciation aspect. You're probably not hearing all the phonemes in the beginning because there's just so much information condensed in any given amount of language, even if it's really.
That sort of gets into what qualifies as knowing a word.
That's a good word.
Because knowing a word in one context doesn't mean you'll know it in another, which is one of the reasons why at Refold we really push for you to have a whole bunch of exposure to the language, not just say, okay, I've got the word now in my Anki deck, I'm going to learn it. You need to see it in a whole bunch of different collocations and different uses.
Yeah, because that's where the acquisition actually happens, not through the Anki, because that's a single usage.
I think something that I did very early on for German, and I'm generally doing the same thing for Chinese, is I'm keeping up this idea that any translation of a word I see is just like kind of a starting point. It's not actually the meaning of the word, and it just helps anchor that word to something so that as I immerse more, I can get a more nuanced definition for it. Because it's actually very hard to think of like German words that mean one-to-one the same thing as their English counterpart. Like technical words, hydrogen is probably directly translatable, but like aside from that, it's pretty difficult.
And then it's even more pronounced when it's in a language as distant as Chinese, That's, because German's pretty related to English compared to Chinese. So
I mean, yeah, but even then, a lot of it, that means that there's a lot more that's like, it should be directly translatable, but it's not, like, because it's like a cognate, but it means something else now, or it's changed its meaning. Whereas I feel like it would be even easier if it were just a completely different word entirely.
Yeah, I think of cognates as sort of like words with built-in mnemonics. Because
like
people tend to think cognates are always going to mean the same thing, and they often don't.
Definitely not.
A good example is
usage too.
In English we have beak, and if I said what's a beak, you would say like the mouth of a bird. But in like Dutch, they have the word bek, which is an animal's mouth, not necessarily specifically a beak. So they're clearly cognate, but they don't mean the same thing.
Right. And then on the flip side, what I meant by usage, you'll have a word that means basically the same exact thing, but it's just way more common in one language compared to another. I know I've used this example before, but it's helpful. I would never use ameliorate in English, but in French and Italian, that's just the normal word to get better, basically. Or in English, you'd have to say get better or improve. But again, those are cognate, but you couldn't just...
You see this with the Romance languages in English specifically. Like, to, opine, right, is a word in English. But in Spanish, you would say opinar as like an actual word in conversation. Whereas I'm not sure I would ever use the word opine when I'm talking to my friends on Discord.
Yeah, usually you have to use a more passive construction in English to have an opinion, right?
It's a lot less common with German, I feel like, because a lot of the more common words are actually the ones that are more similar, I think, compared to fancier words sometimes. Like, I can think of a couple examples that are like different or more common in German than in English, but they're, I feel like, a lot less than if I were, say, learning French.
So, taking it back to comprehension, I noticed something when I'm doing my Chinese versus when I'm doing my Filipino. I'm at the point in Filipino where if I open up a text and I don't understand the bulk of what's going on. This happens not infrequently with like religious texts and some types of poetry. I'm much less likely to go after it than I am with Chinese, because pretty much anything in Chinese is incomprehensible to me, other than very beginner CI videos. I recently watched somebody play The Sims for like an hour, and I acquired a whole bunch of words. I learned the word for kimono. I learned the word for thigh and calf.
This is in
But I
Filipino?
didn't. This is in Spanish.
Okay.
Or sorry, it's not Spanish, Chinese. And I acquired a whole bunch of words despite having low comprehension. Whereas with Filipino, I want to open something up and enjoy it and have high comprehension. My tolerance levels for comprehension are different between the two languages. With Filipino, I have very low tolerance for ambiguity because I'm so used to understanding most things. And with Chinese, since I don't understand most things, my tolerance for it is a lot higher.
Yeah, that's a very similar experience to how I was with German. Like, if I went back to how I started, then it probably would be much, much harder. Yeah.
Yeah, my experience was, I think, pretty similar to Toast with German, with Italian, which was my first, well, I guess second foreign language, but the one that I like actually started immersing with, because I just jumped straight into native content because I just didn't exist back then for Italian, and it still doesn't really exist, at least not in a large quantity. So I had just very high tolerance to ambiguity, and I think that was because I liked how the language sounded. So that's a part of it. And it's also like, it's really interesting because with all the languages I've learned, all the, how do I say this? All the, not expectations, but impressions I had of what the language was actually like were slightly off from the truth, from what it was actually like. I remember when I started like immersing in Spanish, I was like, this is Spanish? I mean, I guess because I was learning Spanish, and I'd been exposed to, since in Southern California, like more Mexican Spanish, more Central American, Latin American Spanish. But oh my god, I'm totally losing this right now. Oh yeah, I'm trying to say that your perception of what a language will feel like knowing can also motivate you to tolerate ambiguity more. Like, there's a lot of things, like, if you feel like, oh man, I really want to understand this language, it'd be so cool to speak it, I love how it sounds, blah blah blah, I'd love to go back, you know, there's so many factors that factor into it psychologically that contribute to you just being able to sit there and like with this wall of sound that doesn't always mean much. It's a lot easier when it's a related language because you will pick up words, and eventually over time your brain will start to parse where words start and stop, because at first it's just all mush. But interestingly, I feel like my tolerance for ambiguity has gone down generally over time because I've been so used to like having high comp, and especially the Romance languages. Even with Catalan, which I'm kind of dipping back into, we'll see. Even there, it's like I have high comp, but it's like it's annoying in some way. It feels like for me I have to change my mentality when this happens, because if this is how it was like with French for a long time too, but it feels like, oh, I'm following a lot, but it still feels like I'm not totally there yet. Why can't I just have really good comprehension, have nuance of everything, be able to reproduce things? Why can't I just be there yet? I mean, I guess that's also a different issue. But
so, something that we talk about in our immersion course is the 4 types of learners. Type 1 can use any content, so they can tolerate simplification and they can tolerate ambiguity. Type 2 have a bias towards content made for native speaking adults. Type 3 prefer learner content. Type 4 people do not like simplification or ambiguity, which is not a good place to be in. I definitely think I'm a type 2 learner. I do not really vibe with the simplified content, you know. I'm not enjoying my 150 character graded readers. I don't really enjoy CI content, but I am able to get enjoyment out of watching somebody play a silly fruit game, despite not understanding a whole bunch of it.
And I
Yeah,
just want to say really quick. Oh, sorry, no, go Toast.
I think that when I started German, I was very much type 2, and then as I got good at it and tried to switch to another language, I ended up being type 4 again because I just got too used to being good at understanding the language. And then with Chinese, I'm interested in going back to type 3 instead of type 2, which is what I did for German. So I think it's interesting that I've been like on every quadrant now.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that. So I've also done some dabbling in Chinese too, pretty recently, and I hope to continue. But for me with Chinese, it's interesting. I've had to like remember lots of kind of mental tools that I used to get myself through learning Italian, because you do need to equip yourself kind of mentally to be like, okay, well, this is what I'm doing here, you know, not to just get lost in like, okay, like, why am I just watching stuff that I don't totally understand? But again, there are better ways to do it. For me with Chinese, interestingly, I've done, you know, a mix of CI and free flow kind of incomprehensible input, just like Twitch stuff, which is like a just chatting thing. It's a nice format because it's not narrated. It's just like someone interacting with a chat. There's definitely lots to pick up on, even if you're basically at 0 words. I noticed that the words I picked up from watching a Twitch just chatting are like different than the ones that I picked up watching CI for whatever reason. I think CI is good, but you actually do miss some things like filler words, for instance. If you're just listening to, and like curse words too, of course, any exclamations or interjections usually are some of the first things that you'll pick up on if you're just hearing someone have a conversation, or just the general flow and tone. I guess tone's not the right word because we're talking about Chinese, but the general flow and feel and rhythm of speech, which I think might even matter more than some of the phonemes. But yeah, with CI, that's a little skewed because people are talking slower.
I know that quite a few of the active admins here at Refold have recently gotten on the ALG, the Automatic Language Growth train, with a high focus on CI content. My experience is that with Spanish CI content, you've got Dreaming Spanish, where they talk about literally everything. There are cooking videos. There are videos talking about, I think I watched one video that talked about drugs entering through Galicia in the 1970s or the 1980s. And it was spoken at it was CI content, right? It's learner content, but it was interesting. I see a lot of poorly made CI content where they're like, let's learn the fruits, let's learn the colors, when that's not necessarily what I would find interesting or useful as an adult learner, you know?
Yeah, and this goes
back to when I was first starting German, and especially with Chinese as well, I like the stories a lot more, where it's like, let's just go through a story, and especially more natural ones, because then it is a lot like just chatting, I feel like. But I think I also want to get a lot more of that, because I've noticed like me and Sky have started roughly at the same time with Chinese, and he's picking up words that I'm not picking up because he gets a lot more of that flow. And I think that's also going vice versa, where I pick up some words from CI that he doesn't pick up with vocabulary maybe, but I think that it's interesting that you get kind of two sides of it.
And that's another thing, is that you can't really, I don't believe, this is my opinion, not scientifically backed, but what I've seen being at Refold for the past couple of years, you don't choose what vocab sticks.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was watching Peppa Pig in Chinese, and I very quickly acquired a word for ice skating, which is a word that somebody who had been at Chinese for 2,000 hours had not yet acquired. Is ice skating a very useful word? No, I don't think so. But my brain latched onto it and learned that word. And I call it the halberd story. So Ryan, aka Cloudy, when he first started learning Korean, he was doing the same thing, learning all the beginner vocab words, and they weren't sticking. But he decided to play a video game in Korean, and he encountered the word for halberd, and it stuck. And that's what I call the Halberd story, where like you learn these weird words that your brain just latches onto, whether they're useful or not.
The amount of weird, like, centuries-old vocab that I have acquired by just reading through a little bit of Franz Kafka once, and like the words just haven't left, and I've never heard them in actual speech by like modern people. I see them sometimes when I go and read other old books, but like never today.
Yeah, even me who doesn't know anything about German, like there's this one these two words from like an opera, a Wagner opera, like stuck, but I don't know like basically any German. So it's like I think it has to do with how this is my 2-cent hypothesis. It's like how the words stick out. I mean, again, it depends on the person, but if they sound more unique in terms of the whole language, for example, like I found that the words that I've picked up in Chinese don't sound like other words. At least I'm not at that level where I can like easily pick up on the differences between ch, ts, on all these sounds. So it's like they kind of just blend together in my brain. But the sounds that are perhaps more similar to languages I'm used to, the words that have those sounds, I tend to pick up or notice more often.
Yeah, and I definitely think the similarity can help. So I've been watching a lot of Taiwanese VTubers lately with other people here at Refold, and the word for borscht came up. We were watching Cooking Simulator, and the word for borscht in Chinese is something like lu so tang. Lu song is an old word for Russia, so it's like Russian soup. And I acquired the word very easily, but again, it's not necessarily a useful word. You know, now I can say borscht in Chinese, but I can't say literally anything else.
Right.
But that's okay, because if you learn 5 or 10 words a day over the course of a year or two, you will learn a lot of words.
Agreed.
Yeah.
This is something we haven't brought up yet, but I wanted to touch on it before the podcast ends. I think it's really interesting, and I would love to get other people's thoughts on it, because it's something I think about constantly, is this idea of the affective filter. Krashen's idea that I know a lot of like current linguists take issue with this, but in my opinion, in my experience, it's been pretty like a pretty important thing to consider at higher levels of learning a language, especially when it comes to output, which this theory hypothesis basically says that it's good to try and I'm totally losing the thread here. How do I explain this? It's you want to see yourself as a part of the in-group, a native in-group, like you want to see yourself
as a speaker of the language.
Exactly, instead of a learner. And I think I've seen a lot of people, I know, maybe I've even talked about this before. Yeah, I definitely did talk about this before. But when it comes to comprehensibility, I think this is a factor. It's like, if something is really, really incomprehensible, and it doesn't feel good to you in that instance for whatever reason, that you're like, oh wow, it feels like they're speaking this language over here, and I'm over here just trying to get bits and pieces of it. I've definitely been in that position before where it's like, I don't know, it's like, I wish I understood more, so it felt like I understood, I was a speaker of the language, because I think what CI sometimes aims to do, or should aim to do, is give you the illusion that you already know the language, or are at a way higher understanding of the language than you are, which might give you these positive psychological benefits that help you feel better about the language. You're like, oh yeah, I have a right to learn this, especially if it's a distant one, right? Because like, I felt this was Chinese. It's like, who am I to learn Chinese? It's like, I don't look very Chinese. But really, there is no difference between a native speaker of, say, Chinese and someone who it's not a native speaker of Chinese, except the native speaker has put in a lot of time especially since they were a kid. So it's like, okay, well, if I just replicate, I mean, this is the whole age out thing. If I just replicate that environment of a kid and put in a lot of time, I should be able to get there. But like, it's like there's this constant like psychological mental game that you have to play. I feel around like, okay, how does my identity fit in with of what I perceive to be the culture of the language I'm learning? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think that the speaker identity definitely plays a role as a learner or a second language speaker. An example that comes to mind was I took Japanese when I was in high school, and I had a friend who did not do any sort of pitch accent. I was unconsciously doing pitch accent because part of my schooling for Japanese was just drilling sentences over and over and over. But he couldn't do it because it sounded too Japanese to him, and it blocked him from acquiring the pitch of words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely seen this in words with accent now.
Yeah, I think speaker identity is important. You know, they've got. I recently interviewed Mike from Glossica, and he is not a fan of mainland China. And he brought up like, oh, that sounds really communist to me, is what he said. And as a speaker, I'm sure he identifies more strongly with, he's been in Taiwan for 20, 30 years now, with Taiwanese. So he strives to speak like a Taiwanese person. If you're learning a language, you can adopt an identity, I think, as a speaker.
Definitely. Toast, do you have any ideas about this, or Tyler?
I don't think I've seen it affecting me that much, but that might be because I don't not fit in that much. Which I mean, like, I started learning German because I thought it would be kind of a better cultural fit for me than the culture I grew up in. And like that was like one of the reasons that led me to start learning that language to begin with. So like from the start, I thought, okay. And even as I was learning more about it, it didn't really go away. So it was kind of like, okay, I'm more like this than I am like what I grew up in. So I should be able to adjust, even if I have an accent.
Italian. But with Chinese? How's that been?
With Chinese, I don't think it's affected me much at all. I'm still very beginner with it, and I haven't noticed it blocking me at all.
Cool.
I don't think it's been a factor. It might not even be a factor because a lot of my friends are learning it anyway. So like even if I am just a learner, I'm still with people that are learning it, and that is in itself a culture that I can be a part of.
Totally. Thank you, Refold.
Thank you, Refold.
So
for motivating me to pick up another language.
for me, it's never really been a problem either. So, yeah.
Like, I could see it becoming a problem where, like, if the speakers just kind of don't accept you as you are, if they make fun of your accent or whatever, if the speakers themselves don't like you, then I can definitely see that happening. But I feel like for just in general, it's like you would need something to, like, with George's example of someone saying that pitch accent just sounds too Japanese, you would have to, like, have some sort of negative experience or something that would make it blocking. And I know that Gratian talks a bit about, like, you have to be in a comfortable environment to learn something. It can't be an anxious environment, like a test setting. And I feel like that is more true to me than just the idea of it being based on seeing yourself as a speaker as a wider concept, just more about avoiding embarrassment maybe and not being... Because I've definitely seen in a German server, there's people who get nervous about outputting because they get told, like, early output is bad and you'll ruin your accent forever. It's a rhetoric that does appear sometimes around here, and it's like, then you can understand why they're suddenly blocking when it comes to output stuff and acquiring stuff like that. But just in general, like, in the neutral case, I feel like it's not a huge factor if you don't necessarily align with the culture of the language you're learning.
Refold tends to attract people who are a little bit shy. And sometimes people with social anxiety conflate that with output anxiety, you know. There's a fear of speaking to people in general. and then there's the fear of outputting wrong. And some people, even when they output correctly, don't want to output with people because they've got social anxiety is what it comes down to. So I always caution people to be aware, like, does this person really have output anxiety, or is it an underlying social anxiety?
Right. I've found that personally. I've had my at times output anxiety stems from me, because in English I don't really have any trouble. But I think I'd have to train small talk. I think I've talked about this before, maybe on the last roundtable, because that's a whole domain that doesn't always show up in immersion, because you have people, talking with each other who are already friends. There's no like moving from, oh, I don't know you, this is the level of formality, and then, oh, over time, over the course of the conversation, it shifts, whole thing. But also, it's like, I feel like for me, I want my level of language to be, I don't know, sufficiently good enough where I feel like can express myself and not just like have to fall back on really basic, I don't know, like grammar patterns or words that I feel like don't fully convey what I'm trying to express. If I'm like, whoa, yeah, dude, that was so cool, but I really meant to say like, yeah, like that gave me such a warm feeling when I saw it or something, it's different, and I don't know, I think it's pretty easily remediable. You just probably read and have more output practice or something, but yeah, I think that's a factor too. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would say, like, again, outputting because you're afraid to make a mistake is different than, or not outputting because you're afraid to make a mistake is different from not outputting because you are shy or you have anxiety about it. As a person with SAD and GAD, social anxiety disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, I get it from both sides of the table. I've been afraid to make mistakes before, but I've also been afraid just to talk to people because I'm naturally a highly neurotic person. So they're two separate issues that I think the immersion learning community doesn't always divide when they should, because output anxiety is like fear of making a mistake and having drilling, automating your wrong language, the language model that you have in your head. Not being afraid to talk to people, which is a whole other issue.
Right. I have actually noticed that I'm less nervous talking to people in my target language, because if I say something silly, then I have an excuse. Like, maybe that's... But, like, I came in here on my first day of Refold, I made a meme in German, and I go back to it, and I'm like, I got nothing right in that sentence, but, like, it was fun. I had fun, and I still have fun just outputting, even if I'm doing silly things, and then later I can turn back to my past recordings with a critical eye and go, okay, let's improve this thing.
I think that's a much more sane approach. I personally am way too perfectionistic. Something a lot of people probably struggle with. I try not to, I think that it's output anxiety is like, oh yeah, I'm gonna make a mistake, or they're gonna think I'm sounding dumb, but also really I think the whole, I'm worried that my model of the language is going to be reinforced by my own bad output isn't that big of an issue if you're already at the point where words are starting to flow naturally out of you, and your model of the language is already fairly developed, where you have a sense for what sounds natural and what doesn't. And even if you say something wrong, usually you have a sense like, oh, I'm not sure if that was right, and then maybe you'll hear in your immersion later like, oh, this is how you phrase it. Oh, I should have said it this way. Interestingly, actually, I wanted to have this as a little aside. When I was in Spain last summer, I was in Catalonia, and basically I was trying to use the little Catalan that I knew. I mean, I basically just defaulted to Spanish because that's what I'm more comfortable with. But I was ordering something, and it was very interesting because in both of these languages, I'm not really at the point where I feel super, or maybe now with Spanish, but at that point I didn't feel super comfortable outputting. Like I had to kind of push myself and it just didn't feel right, even though my comprehension was really high. And basically, I was ordering food, and after I ordered or something, basically after every single interaction with the waitress, excuse me, I realized like 5 seconds or sometimes a whole minute later, I'm like, oh, I should have said it this way. So it's like my brain was working that entire time after I opened my mouth. When I was like, oh, I'm not sure if it should have been said this way. I think my brain went back and looked at all the different experiences I've had, maybe, I'm guessing, listening to the language or being in this specific scenario where, this person's around this age, this is this level of formality or whatever. And then searched my brain and said, okay, what do I say here? But yeah, I think I formed an idea at that point. I was like, maybe input and immersion just helps like kind of shorten that lag time between I should have said it this way and just saying it immediately, But anyways, that was not super.
There's something like
comprehensibility.
Esprit d'Escalier or something, and it's like a French loan into English, like staircase wit or something, where you think of something after the fact and you're like, dang, I wish I could have said this instead.
Mm-mm. Yeah.
And it happens in our native languages,
Right. Totally.
Yeah. I feel like with regard to comprehension, way earlier in the conversation, there was a mention that when you have a lower comprehension, you acquire more vocabulary, whereas when you know the vocabulary, you acquire more grammar. I wonder if, like, the conclusion is just mix, because that's usually what the answer is a balance between the two extremes. But if you mix high and low comprehension, then you get both the grammar and the vocabulary benefits of all that.
Yeah, also especially because usually not the case with Dreaming Spanish, because Spanish has lots of interesting and comprehensible input for the most part on different subjects, and there's just a lot to sink your teeth into. But for other languages that just unfortunately don't have as much content, and the teachers sometimes aren't as good, they'll go on asides, or not, they'll go on asides, they'll do, like Toast said, these counting exercises after they were just doing something interesting. It's like, oh man. Usually what I'm trying to say is the high comprehensibility, I can't think of the word. You're relinquishing enjoyment sometimes, and usually the stuff that you want to watch is perhaps usually often too hard for you. But yeah, giving yourself a taste, at least for me, I found that I really need to have my goal in front of me. I think that's why, like native level speech, I want to never forget what that sounds like. I never want to just only know what CI speech sounds like, kind of slow down, dumb down, because that gives you a skewed perspective too. I think you shouldn't be able to forget.
I think ultimately you need both intensive and extensive input. You need to be dissecting things and looking up words and grammar structures, but you also need hours and hours and hours and hours of input that is comprehensible. I think a balance is a good way of putting it. Like Alex said, you need both.
Yeah, and I've used the term a lot of just eating my veggies when it comes to doing my daily input. Like, I'll do my boring input first, eating my veggies, and then I get the dessert of whatever I find fun in the moment. And over time, it all becomes like one big mesh of I understand everything and it's fine. But at the starting stages, I think it's nice to have my split between learning material and then whatever I find interesting, regardless if it's learning or advanced material.
Yeah, I think it's really important to preserve fun and preserve your idea of your.
That should be the
association with
number one
language.
mantra: is do not turn Refold into work.
Yeah.
That's what burns people out.
Absolutely.
Guys,
What happened to me with Russian is I just ended up making it too intensive, and I was like, I'm done with this.
it becomes a second full-time job, and then you burn out. Guys, we are hitting our 1 hour mark here. Thank you all for coming. Alex, Tyler, Toast. I'm going to have another one of these. I think there's going to be a monthly thing. Here in a month, we'll have another one. Guys, if you're listening to this on YouTube, please suggest some topics, something that you want us to hear the mods and the admins of Refold discuss, and maybe we can discuss some cool topics from you guys, give our thoughts, and it was enjoyable. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.
Hey, as you know, there's a lot of language learning advice out there, which can make it kind of overwhelming and difficult to actually get going on your own learning. If you feel like you're struggling to figure out language learning, you're not alone. It's an extremely complicated process with tons of different steps. If you're looking for a step-by-step guide to create the perfect language learning routine for you, then you have to check out our new course. We spent thousands of hours designing a simple and straightforward process that you can use to create your own personalized language routine that actually works. We understand that every learner is different and that you have to roll with the punches and adapt. Every day for 30 days, I walk you through everything you need to know to build an effective learning routine, no matter your circumstances. We give you the advice and resources you need to ensure your success, so you don't have to waste time looking for stuff to do and can focus on learning. And if any questions do come up, don't worry. We are always there to answer any questions and clear up confusion. And it's all backed by our 90-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. If, for whatever reason, something's not quite working for you, we insist you get every penny back. It's time for you to stop wishing that you could learn a second language. It's time to become the master of your language learning journey. Check out the link below to get instant access and start your journey today.